Dyer wave music. Who is this? I don't know. It's me. It's Amid the Ruins. It's a guy who makes Dyer wave music. It's Amid the Ruins. Dyer wave music. What I've talked about in probably 100 articles at JaysAnalyisis is the implementation of the AI smart grid and the giant smart cities, which is what IBM talks about publicly building. And that's where we're going, and that's what I think we have to be really concerned about. So all of these tensions, they are part of a long-term strategy to basically get everybody moved into mega cities. They'll be forced off of land and so forth for environmental reasons, and basically concocted and invented environmental nonsense. Then you'll be stuck in some hellhole mega city in a, basically a carton-sized apartment living over a Target or something, or inside of a Target or a Walmart, as I said several years ago. It's actually coming true now. There's actually Target cities. This is all part of the long-term globalist strategy. So, but to get there, you've got to have the constant clash, the constant alchemical blending and mixing and smashing together right out of Manichaeanism to produce the convergence, to produce the synthesis. And that's what's crucial in all this, and what is absolutely true from an alchemical, esoteric, philosophical, and geopolitical perspective, the fact the ruling elite seek to be post-human. JaysAnalyisis.com. All right, welcome. We're going late tonight. I'm in a scholarly mood lately. I'm in a stream nonstop type of mood. We're going to be covering Malcolm Lambert's magisterial book, Medieval Heresy. I took these notes back in about 2005 or 6 when I read the book when I was doing my undergrad. It wasn't related to my classes. None of my classes really. I had a few medieval classes. They didn't really deal with medieval church history. A few did, but it was just an interest of my own. So we'll be covering this book in depth. This will be at least a 2-part lecture, maybe more, because of the amount of material. And back then, in my 20s, I took copious notes. I would take hundreds of pages of notes to remember things. And I'm 1 or 2 classes away from a double major in history. So I do have quite a bit of historical reading under my belt. Malcolm Lambert's book is, of course, one of the probably classic scholarly works on the medieval heresy movements. Gregorian reform, all the way up to right before the Reformation. So we'll get up to Jean Hus and some of the pre-Reformation characters. I think Wycliffe might even come up. I don't recall. But I think the book ends with the Bohemian Prague Reformation characters. And I don't recall if I started my note-taking a little bit into the book. But my notes begin with the spiritual Franciscans and the heretical Joachimites. These come up in many modern analyses of the history of revolutionary thought. So if you're interested in the history of Marxism, communism, many people will point to the Joachimites. Even Cardinal Ratzinger in his book, Introduction to Christianity, I think he's got a section on Joachim of Fiore. Jordan Peterson also has commented on Joachim of Fiore. So these are important characters. This is going to be pretty dense. It's not going to be, it'll be like the Pelican introduction that we did. 5-hour lecture covering the totality of Pelican Volume 1. I will eventually do the totality of Pelican Volume 2 and Pelican Volume 3. These are really good. And this book fits in with those. Also, potentially relevant is a book kind of similar to what we're doing tonight. It's Western focused, but Marcia Kolish's book, Medieval Foundations of the Western Intellectual Tradition. I read this back in the 2000s as well. Let's get into it. So another reason we're doing this is because we want to look back after many years of reflecting on Orthodox theology and being grounded in that mindset to reflect on the analyses that I had of Roman Catholicism back in about 2004-05 when I read this as a young trad. I think I was Latin Mass goer at this time, 2004-05. So let's look at where Malcolm Lambert takes us. The Franciscan problem. A lot of these problems, by the way, will be problems due to the theological emphases and dialectical struggles in the West after the East-West split. 1274, this is relevant because 1274 is right about the time that we would say, there's 1054, but 1274 is when the Roman Catholic Church dogmatically at the Council of Lyons states the double hypostatic procession, the doctrine that Orthodoxy does not accept. Welcome, everybody. We've got tonight 166 nerds, and we're going to be getting into some deep stuff. So, Francis of Assisi, as you know, he's one of the most famous Roman Catholic saints. Francis of Assisi is probably the most notable, most recognizable, right, of the Roman Catholic saints, other than Mary or something like that. But there's some great articles, by the way, that will contrast the saints in Orthodoxy versus the saints in Roman Catholicism. And what we start to see is a difference in the devotion and the mystical experiences at this very time period. The different orders of Roman Catholicism will be contrasted to the pretty standard orders of Orthodox monasticism. There's just one kind of Orthodox monasticism. There's not all these different orders, so to speak. Now, Francis is interesting because he comes at a time when there was a lot of religious political corruption, a lot of bishops buying off bishoprics, simony, this kind of stuff, political guys buying off bishops. And so Francis has the idea at his death of a testament. And so he puts forth this, quote, testament. And the later Franciscans themselves, ironically, will turn worldly and become very powerful. And there will be a later counteraction to return to the early purity period after 1274. One of the first spiritual, quote-unquote, Franciscans is the character Peter Olivi. Peter Olivi was dominated the mind of all the, quote, spirituals. He worked out the consistent, what was seen to be the consistent poverty doctrine of the Franciscans. The use of goods was viewed by Peter Olivi as a mortal sin. An absurd doctrine, but nevertheless, apparently Peter thought that was the case. The Roman Catholic Saint Bonaventure did not accept this he thought this was too rigorous, and so Bonaventure said, no, having property itself is not inherently sinful. And in fact, the property used was owned by the papacy, and therefore it was under the rule of Peter. And if Peter accepted it, then it was okay. But you'll notice the locus of the corruption here, there is a legitimate critique because the Roman Catholic papacy had attained to such a worldly, palatial status in terms of money and so forth. And so this is part of the reason why there's a reaction on the part of these Franciscans. It's due to the actual corruption. The Franciscans ran into an immediate controversy with Dominicans. The Dominicans, of course, Thomas Aquinas, the most famous Dominican, Dominic, right, founder of the Order of Dominicans. And the Dominicans, of course, had a much more theological, philosophical approach and would reason with this and said, you guys are really unreasonable. There's nothing wrong with owning property. Olivi, however, prepared the way, interestingly enough, for William of Ockham in his thinking. And this bothered many Franciscans. So Olivi was pretty much a radical. He had some really weird philosophical views. And he'll prepare the way for William of Ockham, the first nominalist. This is when we'll begin to see nominalism rise to the fore. But already you can begin to see the preparations laid for what will come centuries later in terms of communism. And most people do in terms of historical analysis. I've spent many classes in undergrad and grad school studying the history of revolutionary movements and communism. They will go back to Joachim and Franciscan. So you do begin to get out of the dialectics of this period the coming rise of communism. Welcome. We got over 200 nerds on this late Sunday night show. Be sure and if you would leave a like and a share. We've got 62 likes, 203 people in the viewing audience. So if you like this, give me a like. You're going to learn a lot tonight. Because most people aren't familiar with this period. And even I had forgotten, I mean, it's 15 years ago that I took these notes. Even I've forgotten some of this material. All right. 2 decades after Peter Olivi's death, I didn't write down when that was, the Council of Vienne is called, 1312. Now, this is one of the Roman Catholic, Frankish, in the sense of France, King of France, right? Councils. It still did not pin a condemnation on Peter Olivi because of these many disputes going on at this time. And he never receives the scholastic academic recognition that many, I guess, of his followers had hoped for. Many of them believed Peter Olivi's persecution was actually a sign of the end times. The next important spiritual Franciscan is Joachim of Fiore. Joachim took his cue after Peter Olivi's death, and he is the Olivi's own thoughts on eschatology appear to be unclear. However, Joachim was convinced that Olivi was speaking prophetically. Joachim died under the Pope Innocent III, and he spent his life studying the patterns in history with Scripture. So Joachim had this idea we can match up all these patterns in history to his perceived end time speculation, and that because of the corruption now, a couple centuries into 3 centuries into the second millennium here after Christ, this has to be the end times, right? Everybody, it's always this. We are in the end times. And so he had these really kind of arbitrary assumptions that he would pin onto Scripture with the different patterns of the end times that he had come up with. There were, however, 3 popes at this time that encouraged Joachim in his ideas. Lucius II, Clement III, and Urban II all encouraged Fiore, yet his writings received a condemnation for Trinitarian errors at the Fourth Lateran Council. His views on history and the future were not condemned, however, and so many people would still appeal to this. I mean, why are you going to appeal to a Trinitarian heretic for a bunch of end time speculation? I don't know, but nevertheless, many people afterwards will continue to do that. Even up into today, people think this guy was relevant. I mean, if you're bad enough that the Roman Catholic synods condemn you for Trinitarian errors, which themselves are based on Trinitarian errors, then you got to be pretty bad. And I think it relates to his, there's the age of the Father, age of the Son, and then the age of the Holy Spirit, which is ludicrous. His views on history and the future, I already read that. These views were very influential in the 13th century. So this is a big debate of the 13th century. His idea was this: there is a coming third age of the Spirit, and this was going to be exemplified in the religious orders. So there would be this like big revival of the Spirit in this final age. It would like purify and cleanse the religious orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, all of them, the church. And they in turn would then cleanse the church. He attempted to predict a bunch of this end time stuff. He was like a Roman Catholic John Hagee type of character, or Hal Lindsey predicting the end. However, he did excuse me, I misread my notes. He never attempted to predict the dates, so I was wrong about that. But he did say that they were coming in his lifetime, so he kind of did. That's a little unclear. Joachim said the second age, which is the age of the revelation of the Son, was the age of the clerics. Right? The third age, the age of the Spirit, would be with the rise of the spiritual Franciscans and monastics in the church to cleanse and purify the church. It's just really weird ideas. Saint Benedict. Well, for us, he's a saint too. Excuse me. Benedict is a saint. He says that the spiritual age began with Saint Benedict, that Orthodox also recommend, or recognize. But Joachim was unsure that he personally would not enter into this age, but it would come before his death, and then the spiritual age would really kick in when certain abbots came in to control of the Franciscan and Dominican orders. The institutions of the Franciscan and Dominican orders would receive this endowment of the Spirit, and then they would cleanse the church. Thank you for those super chats. Much appreciated. I'll get to those in a little bit. Franciscans were most influenced by Joachim. That the Old Testament provided prophetic parallels was commonplace in his day. It was common to look back at the Old Testament, find patterns for the periods of the New Testament church era. Thus, because there was a parallel of the Old Testament events, there would then be the same events in the New Testament, and so it focused on a lot of these numeric principles. So they would actually try to find numerological, spiritual, allegorical meanings to try to prove these things. In 1260, it happened to be the year 1260, for some reason, in terms of people's calculations, happened to be some kind of a famous date for the supposed end of the world. Flagellants went wild at this time in Italy and Germany and the Alps. Many of these ecstatic flagellants were going nuts, whipping, kicking their own butts. And they focused, this movement focused on this radical asceticism. Oh, that's not even asceticism. It's basically self-mutilation from 1260 to 1290. Then it dies out down, I guess. Many Franciscan friars speculated that Joachim's prophecies were related to Francis of Assisi. So they thought Francis was bringing in this final spiritual age. Some people even thought that Francis of Assisi was the sixth angel of the apocalypse. Here we go. This is the plug-in eisegesis method of, well, whatever you think is going on, plug that into the apocalypse. And that this would herald the new age. Note, of course, that typically speaking, this doesn't characterize Eastern and Byzantine theology. There may have been periods when people thought consistently, I mean, pretty much in every century, somebody thought we're in that last days. But these kind of wild dialectical things like this, I mean, it's not present in the Byzantine normative way of living at this time period. So the two churches have clearly gone, in two different directions. All right, the next guy, I don't know how to pronounce this. I don't know. I can't speak Italian. I guess this guy's Italian. Or, yeah. Guglielma was a dude who died in 1281 in Milan. He was burned by the Inquisition. She was a woman heretic, a prophetess, and her initiates received her as a incarnation of the Spirit. So notice the bizarre Western Trinitarian views have now given rise to bizarre heterodox notions of the incarnation. Now the third person of the Godhead can become incarnate. I mean, we saw this in the Montanus, right? Montanus said he was the incarnation of the Holy Spirit in the early church. We're getting the same sort of flower. And by the way, I'm not saying that this kind of heresy was only in the Latin West. I mean, the Bogomils come out of the East. They will come out of the Orthodox East and infiltrate the West. I'm not trying to oversimplify this. But I do think a lot of these movements in this period of the Latin Church do arise because of bad theology and because of Trinitarian mistakes. Now, some of these notes I can't read, so you have to forgive me there. Behind, these people believe that a woman from their midst would be the incarnation of the Holy Spirit. Her name was Manfreda. I'm not sure what my notes mean here. So I think there's a movement. I don't know. I can't tell what I'm reading. They received her as a Manfreda, I guess. They believe she was the woman. They called her, she would be the first woman pope, an angelic pope. She would convert the Jews and Muslims and usher in the new age. There would be female cardinals and clergy with this new age. There would be 4 new gospels at this time period. Notice the heretics, when they pop back up, it's the same stuff. Right? Montanus said the exact same thing as this. He had 2 women prophetesses, and they were the voice of the Spirit. Okay. So my notes about her in there. Oh, you know what? My notes are out of order. Dang, I just realized that. Well, so I'm not going to go back and start over. We're going to skip back a little bit because these old notes, that page is from a little bit further. So we're going to skip back, sorry about that, to 1078. King Robert the Pious. We're looking at Orleans. Stephen the Confessor seduces the Queen of Constance into his Manichaean heresy. So this is under 1078 under King Robert the Pious. So the Queen becomes a Manichaean, and other potential converts apparently snitched on this king. Anyway, The core of this belief was a form of Gnosticism. Initiates were relieved of all their sins and knew all of the scriptures. And as a result, they would therefore deny the incarnation. And there were then no sacraments that were valid. So I apologize, I jumped ahead with the Joachim section. I didn't realize it was out of order. I just thought my notes began at Franciscans. But we're going to go back a couple of centuries prior to Franciscans. These heretics that will begin to kick off kind of the coming Gnostic and Cathar stuff. It begins with this, I can't read my notes, sorry. Stephen the Confessor in Orleans. I don't know who Stephen the Confessor is. But he seduces a queen. At this time, the king, Robert the Pious, apparently captured and interrogated and convicted and burned some of the original nascent heretics here that are going to kick all this off. And he burned down a house full of these heretics. It's pretty crazy. One of these guys was Paul the monk, who wrote of the tale. Paul the monk is who records this at this time. And he says that the heretics were notorious for having secret orgies. A couple years later, or maybe a couple years earlier, in Milan, 1028 AD, the Castle of Montefort is suspected of housing heretics by the Archbishop Aribert of Milan. The leader is a guy named Gerard, who is then interrogated for his heretical views. These heretics early on in Milan had come up with the idea that all sexual intercourse was absolutely wrong. To eat meat, veganism, is always wrong. It is always wrong to have private property. Remember this. So we've gone back a couple centuries. These guys are going to influence later heretical spiritual Franciscans. They came up with a unique heretical definition of the Trinity, where the Father is God, the Son is a spirit of man, and the Holy Spirit is the understanding of all divine matter. So the Holy Spirit is identified with reason. This is they were reminiscent of Jean Scotus Erigena, and they viewed, so they were influenced by him, I guess, but and he wasn't as bad as them, but I guess they influenced him. But they viewed this world as a demonic inhabitation. Christ alone is the head pontiff. There are no popes, and these sect members would actually kill one another before death. So if you were going to die, the sect would come and go ahead and kill you. So they didn't let anybody die on their deathbed. That's about 1028. Okay. So this is leading us up to 1078 with the heretics in Orleans. And you're starting to notice a pattern of breaks out 1028 Milan, breaks out 1078 Orleans. Next we have, around the same time period, middle of the 11th century, in Aquitaine, the Peace of God heresy. The Peace of God movement was borrowing from older Manichaean texts and just rehashed this and represented it. Arus in 1025 AD, the Bishop Gerard had discovered a group of heretical movements within his jurisdiction and had them imprisoned. These heretics were interrogated in the church and questioned the validity of marriage. So notice what keeps popping up here is, for some reason, in different regions, I think that's the amazing part of this, is that these different regions in the 11th century are popping up with the same heresies. It's very bizarre. So I don't think any of us know if there's one source from which it spread across Western Europe, or if it's just happening to pop up in these different places. Under Bishop Gerard in Arras, Arras, they began to question the New Testament. And because they had rehashed Marcionite ideas, they thought that the New Testament was teaching a God of love and the Old Testament was teaching a mean God. They thought that their ascetic practices of rejecting marriage was called the way of righteousness. Because of the sins and corruption of the clerical priesthood, these groups had all, the clerics had all made their sacraments invalid. So now they're rehashing the Donatist heresy. Thus, the heretics reasoned baptism was unnecessary. Bishop Gerard argued that understanding Scripture lay with the hierarchy and the magisterium of the church and not with these laymen. I can't read that note. Something about the heretics. Oh, the heretics were invited to a meeting to defend their views, and the records of the meetings claim that the heretics had been stupefied by the end of the debate. So I don't know if this continues on or dies out, but you're starting to see these things pop up. Lesser heretics of this time that also popped up, the Soissons. Aldebart was a rural preacher who started walking around Germany and declared himself a saint and distributed toenails and hair clippings to all of his followers. So he was creating his own living, nasty Bunyan relics, right? Here's my toenail clippings, dog. Another weird heretic, Theuda. How'd you like to be named? Theuda. Theuda was a prophetess, quote unquote, who received visions of the end of the world. These visions were imminent and they were coming to Mainz. You notice the patterns here? What are the patterns? End time speculation, sex is evil, Marcionism, Gnosticism. Lay preachers, right? Contrasted with legitimate criticisms of clergy who are corrupt. So now I don't know why I keep going back in time. I don't know if my notes are out of order, but a little bit earlier, similar movements, I guess, in the late 9th century in the West, Bishop Claudius of Turin, he had come up with an iconoclasm heresy where he said that we should have no images in Christian worship and no cross veneration. There should be no cult of saints. There will be no more pilgrimages, and the Pope is the successor to. The Pope is not a successor to Peter. Peter's primacy died with him. So I think that the bishop. I think it's saying the Bishop of Turin had fallen into this heresy, and that could be because he was influenced by the fact that the Carolinians rejected Nicaea too. If you don't know that, we covered that with Sneck. Go listen to the Frankish papacy stream that I did with Sneck. I think that's what my note is saying. If I get some of these facts wrong, don't go too hard on me because I'm trying to decode college notes that I wrote 15 years ago. From the death of Louis the Pious to the breakdown of the Carolinian Empire, there does not appear to be a major Latin outbreak of heretical movements. I'm not saying that the Carolinians are Orthodox. They're not. What I'm saying is that from the vantage point of Latin theology and Catholicism, Romanism, there doesn't appear to be a major outbreak for about 100 years. So the Carolinians, and then when they start to decline, you start to see what this book is talking about as heresies, meaning these resurgent Gnostic movements is what they're talking about. All right. Welcome, everybody. We've got a good little crowd here. Late night nerds, 223. 223 nerds late at night. Welcome. Thank you for those super chats. You can always super chat via Streamlabs in the show description. I'll get to those in a minute. Death penalty for heretics. Since the church, of course, had penetrated all society, we begin to see the state having penalties for heretical movements. Now, a lot of people think this is so mean, it's so mean. There's a reason for this, because typically speaking, heretical movements were not just a theological, debate. they also represented social revolution, you see. And that's part of the reason why the states, the various states, would go so hard on heresy, is because it would upset the entire social order. And the authorities of the time, both church and state, assumed correctly that heresy and revolution or rebellion went together, because they did. So if we begin at this time period, I don't know if this is 9th or 10th century. My notes are fail at this point, but right around this time period, 10th century, 9th, 10th century, at Orleans, heretics are first burnt, where the Queen of Orleans struck out her confessor's eye. At Milan, the heretics were committed to the purge, to the pyre, meaning they were burnt. And at Goslan, heretics were hung. So death penalty for heretics is beginning at this time period. And by the way, in the East, it's not unheard of. There were the tendency, like in the Code of Justinian, is that the church would make a pronouncement, hand them over to the emperor, to the imperium, to make a decision. And sometimes that was banishment. Sometimes it was some other kind of fine. And there were instances of death. So it's not totally unheard of in the East for there to be such things. This is a weird one. Leotard of Avitas. Leotard of Avitas. Tard of Avitas. Real guy. I think this is about 10th century. Now, this guy thought that bees had entered his pee-pee, and because the bees had flown down his pee hole in a dream, I'm not joking, in a dream, the bees told him to leave his wife and go live in the fields as a hermit. So he, being impelled by the bee spirits that entered his pee-pee, he broke into the village church, grabbed the crucifix, and said there were no need to pay tithes to the church. He took that crucifix and started preaching in the fields, and the peasants followed him. Some of what the prophets and apostles said, Leotard proclaimed, was useful. However, it was better to follow Leotard of Avitas. Leotard, it appeared, had come in contact with the Bogomils. Now, the Bogomils are going to become important here, because the Bogomils are these heretical Gnostic ideas that were centered in the East. So they came from Orthodox lands. Perhaps they'd been exiled. And they influenced some of these weirdos like Leotard of Avitas. Leotard also had Donatist ideas, in that you were better off if you committed a form of suicide. The Donatists were known to fling themselves off of buildings and fall down wells to induce their own martyrdom. So Leotard, like the Donatists, committed suicide by throwing himself down a well. He may have had a form of ergotism, according to Leotard of Avitas, some kind of infection or STD. And this was early 10th century. Okay, so my notes are a little out of order, but this guy is interesting because the bees possessed his wee-wees. Heresy in the early 10th century did not last. Only in the diocese of Chalon-sur-Marne and in Liege, as far as our records show. Only those places does it appear that more than once in any given site. It seems to have been snuffed out by the state repressing the possibility of heretics preaching openly. Extinguishing heretical circles, as soon as they were discovered, did not allow them to continue or flourish. Without having a remnant of proselytizers to continue the heresy, the heresies died out within a few years or within that generation. As soon as the publicity was done, the heretics were done. After the hanging of the accursed from the Upper Lorraine in 1051, silence descends upon all heretical movements for a good while. That's page 31 of Malcolm Lambert. 12th century heresies. Now we're moving up to where I originally thought we had started. My notes are out of order. I'll try to put these back in order. 12th century heresies. Early in the 12th century, heresies began to reappear. The 11th century heretics sought flight from the world and the church. 12th century heretics now took on a dogmatic issues themselves and desired changes within the institutional Latin Roman Catholic Church. Preaching gets more aggressive. Heresiarchs use physical force in this period. One example of this is, forgive me, Sneck, I don't know how to pronounce these things. Aeon de la Trois, Aeon de la Trois mobilized a peasant force to rob churches in Brittany. Arnold of Brescia mobilized Republican government, a revolutionary Republican government, to hold Rome against the Pope. Heretics began to care for social concerns and made the social concerns an intimate part of their new gospel. As usual, heretics mobilize the state as a means to control, influence, and put bishoprics in the church. As we will see, the same type of pattern for Caesaropapism, and by the way, Papalo-Caesarism is just exactly the same thing. We see this in heretical Byzantine emperors that try to control the church, heterodox iconoclast emperors. We see it in the West here with the heretics in these cases trying to get heretical kings to change the church. In the time of the Reformation, the exact same thing will happen. German princes ally with Luther to change the church. The incidents prefigure the investiture controversy to come. For example, the knight Erlembald and his brother Landulf, notary of the church at Milan, Erlembald almost usurped a position in the priesthood as a knight. He just took it, or he almost did. All right, next famous heretic of the period, Henry the Monk. Henry the Monk was a wandering preacher, an apostate monk, and he may have been at some point ordained as a priest. He entered, it looks like it says Kmart, but I can't read my note. He entered something to preach some city. I can't tell what city my note is, but if you look up Henry the Monk, I'm sure you can find it. He entered the city in 1116 and proceeded by two of his disciples carrying a cross and an iron-tipped staff. He walked in bearded, barefoot, and wearing poor clothing. So he had like an entourage, basically, of weirdos in front of him carrying in a procession. At first, he only condemned the sins of the clergy, and so he tried to make peace with whatever this city is. I can't tell what my notes say. And he came up with an odd dogma that the prostitutes in the city needed to burn their hair and their clothes. If they stood nude before all, I can't read what my note says there, but anyway, they're supposed to marry other people. So he thought he could like get them all to shave their head and stand nude, and then he could like find husbands and wives. So I guess he had a kind of a good idea here, but it's also a little bit crazy here. However, Henry the Monk was became a radical anti-cleric. He started deciding that there was no need for any kind of sacraments or priesthood. Only the individual was responsible to God. We'll hear this in the Reformation. And there was no such a thing as original sin. And in fact, the Pelagians were correct. It was not necessary at all to baptize infants, so he crossed out infant baptism. Baptism was a decision of an individual at an adult age. There no longer needed to be any prayers for the dead or any Eucharist. Henry the Monk is a Baptist. Henry the Baptist monk in, I don't know what century we're in. 1116. Here's your first. So by the way, if you want to play the landmark Baptist game and trace everything back here, you could probably do it with the Henry the monk. Of course, you don't have to worry about actual, doctrines, or, you can be anti-Trinitarian or whatever, but at least you can find a guy who had believers' baptism. There's not a lineage, really, but I mean, you could find these kind of weirdos here and there. Peter of Brius, or Peter de Bru. He is our major source for this heretic. Peter is another Peter the Venerable. This is the beginning of the Petrobrusians. The Petrobrusians will be pre-Baptists. Baptists will say, we like the Petrobrusians. So here's where we start to get Baptist stuff. Not literally, but you know what I mean. But Peter the Venerable, the writer, the chronicler, wrote the Contra Petrobrusians. So he wrote a treatise against these heretics. He says that this Henry the monk guy was one of the early founders of the Petrobrusian sect. They probably only had similar tendencies, and Peter might not have actually been a member, but regardless, it's the same ideas. They didn't believe in having church buildings. They didn't believe in church prayers for the dead, no masses or Eucharist in terms of the Petrobrusians. Peter de Bru was doctrinally even further than Henry. Peter said the Old Testament was full of evil, mean stuff, and that it was pagan to venerate the cross. Here we go. Marcionism, iconoclasm. Right back where we were. All right. Enter our first Roman Catholic doctor of the church during this period to fight with these guys. Bernard of Clairvaux. Of course, you probably are familiar with Bernard. I've got Bernard's treatises over here on my shelf. Bernard of Clairvaux, famous Roman Catholic mystic, fought against Henry the monk. He wrote against him at Toulouse and successfully defeated Henry in his claims on the populace in the year 1140, in the 1140s. So Bernard had a lot of success fighting against this heretic. Reconvinced the crowd to go back with him. The church, according to Peter de Bru, the Petrobrusians, was a spiritual congregation just of the faithful. So here we go, the invisible church, heresy of the Calvinists and the Protestants. Here it is with this guy. Oh, you dirty institutional church people, we're better than you. We're the pure people. You're all corrupt, and so we're the true spiritual congregation. The Henricians. The Henricians, the followers of Henry, not exactly the same as the Petrobrusians. The Henricians, in agreement, rejected all outward forms of worship. So here they have a Gnostic iconoclasm. The Petrobrusians the Petrobrusians rejected the Old Testament explicitly, and all the church fathers, every church tradition, anything like infant baptism or infant communion. They rejected a sacrificial Eucharist, singing in the church, prayers for the dead, and they said their simple method of proving this was a literal appeal to the Gospels, by which they meant they just, whatever they read and what they thought was the immediate meaning, disproved all this other stuff. Jesus didn't have prayers for the dead. Jesus didn't have a church. Jesus doesn't mention church, but just really low IQ, peasant type stuff, basically. However, they oddly believed that the Eucharist was a transformation, but it had only happened once at the Last Supper. Okay, whatever, dude. Christ had no intention of anyone continuing the Eucharist after this period. And so, ironically, no one should do the Lord's Supper. So this actually anticipates the Salvation Army heresy and General Booth. So if you didn't know The Boothism of the Salvation Army believe that you should not have baptism or the Lord's Supper. It's weird. So Peter de Bru acts as a kind of heretical John the Baptist. This is important because Peter de Bru is the John the Baptist that will prepare the way for the great heretics of the Middle Ages, the Cathari. Cathari will be probably the most important, outright crazy heretical and most powerful heretical movement of this period. Tanchelm of Antwerp. That's a cool name. Psych! How'd you like to be named Tanchelm of Antwerp? Rejected all church authorities. He popped up and gathered a crowd of followers by preaching only to the peasants and totally rejected any need for an institutional church. The institutional church was a brothel, the horror of Revelation, and Tanchelm said he himself was God. He entered into a symbolic marriage with a statue of Mary in a bizarre ceremony, and also during this time period will prepare the way for the rise of Gnosticism. I think we mentioned Arnold of Brescia, but Arnold of Brescia of the 1130s studied under Peter Abelard. However, Bernard of Clairvaux had Arnold of Brescia condemned, or I think Bernard has Peter Abelard condemned, but at the Council of Sens in 1140. But Arnold befriends Guy, a guy named Guy, who was the papal legate to Bohemia. Pope Eugenius III invited him to Rome to keep watch over him. But the Pope's involvement in all of these temporal affairs agitated Arnold of Brescia. Arnold decided that the papacy was corrupt and too involved in temporal politics, and so he gathered support from Roman citizens and expelled... this is the guy who had the Republican Revolution. He gathers together Roman citizens and expels the Pope and taught that the emperor should receive the crown from the people and not the Pope. Because that would be Republican, right? Not papal. But this is also interesting because this is where we're starting to see the rise of republicanism, you see. Many of these Gnostic sects will favor communal living, Italian Republic, Renaissance Republic, Plato Republic, Plato communism in the Republic. You see the tendency here, that what pops up here. Arnold's theology led him to an extreme democratic view of politics. Thus, there was no real hierarchy. And Pope Hadrian II hunted down Arnold of Brescia and had him killed. Remember Aeon de Troyes that we mentioned earlier? Aeon de Troyes had gained a peasant following, and through preaching to all these peasants had convinced them to oppose all externals in religion, all buildings, all statues, images, icons. He eventually proclaimed himself the Son of God and had a scepter formed in the shape of a Y and called and deemed his followers apostles, prophets, and angels. The Y meant that 2/3 belonged to God and 1/3 belonged to Satan. So he would carry the staff around and be like, these are the 2/3 that belong to God, and the rest, because of the text in Revelation that 1/3 fell, 1/3 of the angels. The Council of Rheims heard all of his revelations and claims, and they all laughed. We mentioned, by the way, Council of Rheims. It comes. I don't. There may have been more than one Council of Rheims, but it's mentioned in Denzinger as one of the early ones that explicitly teaches absolute divine simplicity in the radical sense, which is in Denzinger, by the way. Many of the theologians and scholars present at the Council of Rheims that laughed at Aeon de Troyes actually just said he was insane. But you notice that what's interesting is that the enthusiasts, these insane religious characters, find it seems to be pretty easy to go out and just kind of gather and create a cult, right? but you could easily get burnt for doing this, right? So, first outbreak of the major heretics that are going to be like a movement, right? We're going to get to the Cathars. So all of this has prepped for the real heretics of this period, the Cathari, the perfect, the pure. Some connection with Eastern Bogomils of Byzantium and the Balkans had taken place. Nobody exactly knows, according to Lambert, how the Bogomil heretics of Byzantium, who were Gnostics, who had gone into the Balkans, had some kind of contact with these people in Western Europe. Bernard of Clairvaux said that the Cathari had been influenced by three heresies: the Manichaeans, the Sabellians, and the Arians. Right? Now, Manichaeans are the dualists that taught that matter was evil and it was in some sort of eternal battle with light versus matter or whatever. As we know from my recent lectures, the Sabellians were modalists. They taught that Father, Son, and Spirit were just modes of God, not three distinct persons. And of course, we all know that Arians denied the full deity of the Son. The first outbreak of the Cathari, Rhineland, 1143. A provost tells Bernard of Clairvaux that a group of heretics had organized their own bishopric in Cologne. The provost told Bernard that they held to a Gnostic, no-meat, vegan view. And they had a laying on of hands ceremony that included secret rites, secret society rites, basically. And then ultimately they decided that marriage was false. Now remember, if you read John of Damascus's Heresiology, which we've mentioned many times, Hippolytus, many other church fathers talk about in their heresiologies vegan groups, the Ebionites, the Encratites, the Pythagoreans, all mentioned by John of Damascus as vegan heretics. What's popping up again here? Vegan heretics connected to their Gnosticism. Now, why would there be a connection between veganism and Gnosticism? Why, it's quite easy. Let me explain to you. If you don't believe in Genesis, or if you believe that Genesis is an evil God, what does the evil God of Genesis tell Noah? You can eat meat. What did he tell Adam and Eve? You can have marriage. So if the Old Testament God is the evil, mean God, and he's the one that said eat meat and get married, thus the reasoning of the Gnostics and the Cathari. There you go. But, now, by the way, I had a great video that I did on the movie Eye of the Devil, which has kind of a history. It's like Eyes Wide Shut, 30 years before Eyes Wide Shut. It has Donald Pleasance as the Gnostic Luciferian priest, literally a Luciferian priest, and what's Roman Polanski? Sharon Tate as it's her first role, and she plays a witch, a Luciferian witch, and basically there's this ancient Gnostic pagan cult that owns the entire city and castle out in France somewhere. Great movie. If you're looking for an older esoteric Eyes Wide Shut cult movie, go watch Eye of the Devil. Of course, once that was one of my best videos, 100,000 views right away, and of course it gets deleted, taken down. It was awesome. I still have the video, by the way, but I was drawing from all of this research that I've done on the Cathari. And by the way, I know that the Cathari in the actual history didn't do human sacrifice, but I'm not convinced that that's the Cathari story. I'm not convinced that they weren't doing that. We don't know what all they were up to. I mean, they're a secret society. They invent a counter hierarchy. That's what's weird about this group, is that they don't do like the peasant thing like most of the weirdos at this time period of, the bees flying in their pee-pee and then they're running through the fields. These guys actually set up an altar church, like a counter church. Interesting. Now let's get back to the Bogomils. So they are the ones that influence the Cathari. We don't exactly know how, but in the 10th century, the Bogomils were present in Bulgarian villages. Some Bulgarian village priests had come up with an idea of dualism. Right? Good force, good God versus evil force, evil God. This dualistic notion had spread to Constantinople. They came to the conclusion that everything that is physically perceived or seen is itself evil. It's identified with evil. Satan is the one who created the flesh itself. The initiates of this sect therefore believed in a severe asceticism to punish the flesh. Okay, that's all the sort of the basics that Lambert mentions of the Bogomils. Now the heretics over in Cologne had claimed that theirs alone, this new rising Cathari movement, theirs alone is the true church. The heretics thought that the life of apostolic poverty itself is what gave them the moral high ground over the institutional papal succession church. Cathari. Now, some of the Cologne heretics said that no priests of the church are valid or are validly ordained, for they said the apostolic office has been corrupted through the involvement in secular affairs. He who sits in the chair of Peter therefore lost Peter's power to ordain, which was bestowed upon Peter himself. Because the apostolic see does not have this power, the archbishops and bishops who led worldly lives within the church could not therefore receive from Peter the power to ordain anyone. Hence, they just rehashed Donatism. Infant baptism, therefore, was not only not necessary, it wasn't biblical. There was no revelation about the afterlife, and therefore no purgatory. There was no need for any kind of penance. And Ecbert, the Benedictine abbot of Schonau, eventually was influenced by some of these heretics and he went in to study with these heretics to see what they were saying, and found out that some of them believed in a Docetic Christology, right? Docetism, that Jesus wasn't really human, his death was a phantasm, etc. Some of them had imbibed the Platonic doctrine of the transmigration of souls and the creation of matter in this world by an evil god. Are you noticing a pattern here? It's always the same thing. Marcionism, Gnosticism, evil Old Testament God. Always, it's the same. It never fails. Now, why aren't the heretics more creative? Every now and then they get creative, come up with something a little weird, but why do they always tend to the same ideas? Because it's the same spirit motivating them, obviously. I mean, it's like they don't even know that the exact same heresy existed in the 2nd century that Irenaeus wrote against. Hopefully I'm not talking into it yet. We got 266. Welcome. We're almost up to 300 in this late night stream. Welcome, everybody. If you want to support, we got a couple fat super chats there. I appreciate that, but glad to see everybody here tonight. You can do your super chats via Streamlabs, and I will come to those here in a minute. This is a little slow going. My notes are hard to read, but hopefully this is fun and weird information. So Ecbert the Benedictine is milling about amongst these guys. He's infiltrated the weirdos, and he has found out that they've got these Gnostic views. Ecbert believed the heresy to have an international character. This is interesting. So it's almost like he's conspiracy theorizing that maybe there is an international movement. I think that's what my notes are a little smeared, so it's kind of hard for me to see. See that? Spilled coffee on this so some of the words are smeared, but it says in Flanders they were called the Affales. In France, the Texarant, the weavers. In Germany, they were called the pure ones. And so, I see. So Ecbert, because of this network of this that has popped up of these heretics in these different cities and countries with the same names and same ideas, he's beginning to suspect that this is a larger movement. I see. So Ecbert the Benedictine starts to preach sermons against the heretics. They were... I can't read what that says, but they Ecbert attempted to refute them by exposing them to the dogmatic assumptions and bases upon which the entire heresy rested. Ecbert referred to much of their views as simply a repeat of Manichaeanism, and therefore if Manichaeanism was refuted, so was their entire heresy. All right, thank you for those super chats. In 1165, a conference was held, a local synod or conference, I don't know if it's a synod or conference, at Lambert's castle outside of Albi in southern France. The Cathari there had a formidable standing. Local heretical leaders, who were known as the good men, debated openly their opponents before a distinguished gathering of scholars, nobles, heretics, priests, etc. The institutional Roman Catholics had to restrict the citations to proof texts from the New Testament, since the heretics would only accept any kind of argument or proof from the New Testament. So, which I guess makes sense. That's where they went. The battleground was the New Testament. These early Cathari argued that the true bishops and kings must live as St. Paul described, or they are not valid at all. The normative Roman Catholic, the institutional Roman Catholics tried to get them to debate anything about dogmatic issues like the Trinity or whatever, but the Cathari would only talk about the moral precepts. They refused to swear to any oaths. Again, a lot of this is Baptist. You'll see this repeated by later Baptists. And when the Roman Catholics achieved the upper hand in the debate, the heretics would feign or pretend that they were Orthodox. However, they would not take any oaths. So they would just like change the words and, oh, yeah, okay, well, fine, we believe that. But they would just reinterpret it to mean something else. 1167, in the village of St. Felix, an international conference of duelists takes place, and this allows for the achievement of a better structure for Catharism. So they actually have this kind of their own little synod here at a village, and this aids the growth of Catharism. The Cathari at this fake Cathari council made up plans to send out missionaries. And they did. They sent out missionaries. Cathari reached Lombardy and established a hold there before 1167 by sending missionaries from northern France. The movement's strength lay in its ethical appeal to peasants and layfolk. They preached poverty, self-sacrifice, and strict chastity. And this converted people more easily than when they revealed their false doctrines. Interesting. So they did this kind of classic cult trick where you do all this do-goodery stuff and talk about look how we're goody-goody. And then but by the way, we secretly teach blah, 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 crazy stuff, right? This is a classic cult tactic. So within roughly 2 decades from the first appearance of the Bogomils at Cologne, the Cathari had disseminated themselves from Rome to the Pyrenees to the Italian peninsula. So the Cathari had quite a bit of success. Waldensians. Now, again, keep in mind, what is allowing the proliferation of this stupid heresy. The corruption of the existing institutional church, of course. If the institutional church were not so ridiculously corrupt, which obviously it was, and even the saints, quote unquote, of the Roman Catholic Church of this time would admit all that. They would preach against the corruption. You see that heresy and schism and sins such as that become scourges for the existing clergy and existing church. Heresy is a scourge and a punishment, a chastisement from God on the church. Waldo. Here comes the next of the favorites of the Baptists, the Waldensians. The Waldensians are a late 12th century, can't read my note, movement. Their focus was the institutional church's hierarchy. Their movement spread to Italy at the time of Pope Lucius III. In Italy and Languedoc, heretics had eventually achieved total freedom. So the laws of those states had now allowed free reign of these guys. The Waldensians, Peter Waldo, I think his name is Peter Waldo, but Waldo, where's Waldo? Waldo decided, as a rich businessman, that he would commit to poverty. There we go. That's why he was able. So he does this big thing where, I'm going to give away all my business wealth. I'm going to become poor. He then translates these scriptures into the vernacular and begins translating the church fathers. He desired to become a wandering preacher. And the initial conflict became his dispute with local church leaders over orders, or the right to go and publicly preach. The institutional church appealed to the Pope and sent representatives to the Third Lateran Synod in 1179. They were found to be inadequate to preach, and Pope Alexander III welcomed their evangelical councils, but told them not to preach the gospel or doctrine or theology publicly. Waldo was willing to accept Orthodox statements and be submissive. However, eventually, in time, he fell into schism and began preaching because he felt called to do it by reading Scripture. Now notice, in the Orthodox East, this is not a problem because the Orthodox East has always held to vernacular Scripture. So even though this guy probably isn't exactly right in what he's doing, he at least does have a correct idea that why are we not putting the liturgy into the language of the people? The church has always put the liturgy into the language of the people. The entire Orthodox East does this. This is stupid. The Humiliati, new movement here at the same time. In northern Italy, a movement of radicals called the Humiliati. It's like the opposite of the Illuminati, the Humiliati. In northern Italy, believed in the evangelical councils. By that just means to renounce monastic type of vows, right? To renounce ownership, marriage, these kinds of things. Poverty, chastity, obedience. But they decided that also all oaths should be rejected. They desired to preach, and once again, Alexander III denied the request of these people. However, they decided again that they were called to preach directly by God, and so they fell under the papal ban. The Pope, Lucius III, writes a bull called Ad Abolendam in the 1180s, and it calls for cooperation with Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in the first attempt to deal with these heresies on an international scale. So by now, all these different little crazy groups had gotten so annoying and had popped up everywhere. It's now called the attention of Rome. So Lucius III has said, all right, we got to do something. And he calls for aid of the emperor. Now this is, unfortunately, there's a big smudge here of coffee and some of these notes I can't see. So I'll try to make it out as best I can. So the way they decided to deal with the heretics was first to send out trained theologians to go and visit the parishes and re-educate and teach, basically catechize the people. People that were recalcitrant and would not listen after periods of catechesis or preaching from different religious orders and monks would then be handed over to the state to receive some form of state punishment. This proved difficult in the places where the state leaders had already began tolerating heresy. The papal bull was still sent out and propagated as an ideal. And so interrogation was to be done at this time by some experienced, trained theologian. The bull reorganized the episcopal something I can't read, and it offered no solution to the recognition and classification of heresy. Though many were named and anathematized, it didn't offer a way to solve it. The papal bull anathematized the Patarines, the Cathari, the Humiliati, and the Arnoldists. The only distinction made for heretics was those who preached licit and illicit, and those who openly preached heresy. Next movement, another one pops up, the Speronists. A layman by the name of, in Lombardy, by the name of Speroni, was a jurist. Between 1177 and 1185, he fomented a movement against the church that lasted about 50 years. Speroni came up with some extreme tenets. Number one, the rejection of all and every church authority. Number two, there is no priesthood. Number three, baptism and the Eucharist were stupid inventions of the church. Number four, all formal acts of worship were de facto idolatrous, since all followers of Speroni had already achieved a perfect union with the Word. So notice, antinomianism, radical justification by belief alone is already beginning to pop up. They held to an interior baptism of the Spirit that wasn't in any way necessary in terms of water baptism. The only thing that mattered was the inner sanctification of the believer by the Spirit, and so therefore there was no original sin, and all men were already predestined or elect no matter what they did. So here comes a radical predestinarianism. The elect always remained elect no matter what they did. There could never be any change to that. So this was weird because they were Pelagians, but they had a strict double predestination view. The Speroni. My Speroni. 1206. Dominicans. You've probably heard of them. Thomas Aquinas. Dominic and his prior, Diego of Osona, decide to live in poverty like the Cathari. So we'll give Dominic some credit here, because rather than trying to force or persuade the Cathari with burning at the stake, he's like, all right, I'm going to go live like these guys so that they don't have any bogus moral claim high ground. So he pledges poverty, chastity, and obedience, and establishes a house in Proville for women and girls that were rescued from the crazy Cathari. In 1216 to 1217, he received recognition from Pope Innocent III, and he is, obviously this is where the Dominican friars come from. The Dominicans eventually grow into an international order, international in the West, and they become known for debating and confronting heretics. They are, of course, the most philosophical and theological, eventually producing Aquinas, etc. Their task was the confutation and refutation of heresy. 5 years earlier, Francis of Assisi had been something. I can't read my notes there, but Francis apparently had thought that a procreation, emphasis on creation worldview would perhaps be the answer to the Catharized Gnosticism. So if you know about, Francis is brother's moon, sister moon, brother's sun, or whatever. It's a reaction to, these kinds of extremes. Lateran IV and Pope Innocent III. The active, I can't read my note there, participation of Innocent III left a body of case law and precedent for the litigation and debate to deal with heresy. In other words, basically litigation, case law, canon law under Innocent III set a good precedent for how to deal with heretics, is what my note is trying to say. In 1207, Innocent III decrees that all the goods of heretics should be confiscated and their homes destroyed. Lateran IV contains a dogmatic statement against the Cathari to this effect. By the way, how does that jibe with Vatican II? Heretics should have their property confiscated and their homes destroyed. Vatican II says there's no heretics. Freedom of religion, bro. Could you imagine? Imagine trying to smush freedom of religion into Innocent III. What a joke. This is why the deeper that you go into Roman Catholicism, just the prima facie absurdity of Vatican II. It's just ludicrous. You want me to believe that God in this century was ordaining that the church burn heretics, confiscate their property, destroy their homes, and now he's decided that we all need to have Assisi gatherings where we pray with all the religions. I mean, give me a freaking break, dude. Give me a break. Lateran IV contains these dogmatic statements against Cathari. Joachim of Fiore, we already mentioned Joachim. That's where my notes were out of order. But Joachim of Fiore is also condemned at Lateran IV because Joachim of Fiore attacked the Trinitarian views of Peter Lombard's sentences. Right around the same time, Amaury of Beauvais, I don't know what that is, I can't say that. Yet another heretic condemned for his views that derive from John Scotus Erigena. He developed the idea that everything was evolving to become spirit. So literally Teilhard de Chardin, Teilhardism, already present in Amaury of Beauvais. Wow. Honorius III succeeds Pope Innocent III and was less resolved and less original, but still dealt with heresy. Honorius III made sure anti-heretical legislation was part of secular codes of law. Emperor Frederick II made such laws part of his imperial legislation. Burning was now the punishment for the recalcitrant heretic. That is the one who has been preached to, catechized, warned. If they keep doing it, then you go to the stake, bro. The major innovation, however, comes with Pope Gregory IX. Pope Gregory resorts to special agents equipped with full powers directly from the papacy to hunt down the heretics. In 1231, he issues the General Commission to something, I can't read it, smudged of Regensburg. I almost feel like I'm reading ancient documents because they're frazzled and smudged, and it's just my own notes from 15 years ago. The episcopal local Inquisition was then established. At this time, thus was born the Papal Inquisition. Unlike bishops, the direct emissaries of Gregory IX had the power directly from the Pope, and they didn't need the authority of any local bishop. Their job was that they were tasked with the suppression of heresy. Usually this mission was fulfilled by Dominicans. Thus, the Inquisition. Now, pay attention, because every idiot in the world thinks they know about the Inquisition. 99% of people don't actually know the history of the Inquisition. And Malcolm Lambert is not unfair. Like, he's a balanced, just scholar. I think he's some kind of Anglican guy, but regardless, he's a historian. And he's not unfair. He doesn't like, he's not after the papacy. He's not after trying to vindicate heretics. He's just trying to give a historical analysis. The Inquisition. So the way this begins is that the inquisitors went out and they would register and log people suspected of going out and preaching the mistakes and these weird views. Now, it's not just anybody who has a wrong idea go to the flames. That's not true. What they were doing was looking for the people fomenting the social revolution. So basically they were like COINTEL or something like they're trying to find the agitators and the revolutionaries. The idea was that the Inquisition could be eventually tasked with becoming an international, and it is now at this point, an international body, usually Dominicans, which could link up with other orders to get information everywhere to prevent the escape of heretics from being discovered and found out. So what would happen was, if the Inquisition came and the heretics, usually Cathari, found out about this, they would just try to flee to another city. But the reason that they wanted to link up with other orders in other places was so that they couldn't do that and get away. They couldn't be heretical refugees. The Inquisition was thus the heir to a body of legislation that reached back to what was that papal document? You know, the one on heresies, right? My notes are smushed, I can't see it. There was thus a trend now that both the civil and the ecclesiastical law and powers tended towards an inquisitional rather than an accusatorial procedure. Now this is interesting because this will be, a lot of people don't even know this, but this will influence later Western legal theory. Did you know the Inquisition influences Western legal theory? And not entirely in a bad way. That's because prior to this, there were less rights for people accused, because a king could just come in and say, I deem you a heretic, I'm burning your ass. The church stepped in, to the credit of the Western church at this time, and said, this is not right. We need trials. There are rights that the accused have. So rather than just an accusation procedure, there should be a kind of catechesis and a kind of ecclesiastical barrier, buffer between people and just some king coming in and saying, I'm burning everybody. Did you know that? Most people don't know that that was actually part of why the Inquisition came to be. In 1252, Innocent IV decides that that torture could be used in the case of certain heretics so that they might spill the beans on the other heretics and their plans. This was because this was under the aegis of the fautorship of you're a fautor of heretics, a supporter of heretics. Fautorship of heresy was thus a grave crime and an obstruction of what the inquisitor was trying to do, and thus you could be labeled as a fautor. The place of uncertainty about the use of force against heresy that had Oh, that was a popular debate in the 11th and 12th century, was now at an end. So even in the 11th and 12th century, it's interesting that there's debates about whether the state or force could be used against heretics. Now, by this time, there's no question about it. This forced the heretics to go underground and to become, quite literally, conspiratorial and a secret society. This is what Lambert says. Innocent III always stressed, however, that the connections between the failure of the clergy were the real reasons for the emergence of heresy. Innocent III is correct. You just heard me say that. Now we return to Catharism. Again, the main heresy. Now we've seen how they arose, but we haven't really focused on them. Catharism was the most powerful heresy of the 13th century without question. The Catharis stimulated the development of the Inquisition. So it's actually the Cathari that brought about the reason for the Inquisition. The Cathari were most strongly established in Italy and Languedoc. They were the perfecti, the perfect. Amongst the Cathari, their leadership were the perfecti. That is the elite of the Cathari. The elite, these inner circle of secret leaders, had obtained the right of what they called the consolamentum. The consolamentum was a ritual that they had borrowed from Bogomilism, the Bogomils. And this right to call God the Father is given. It's given to you in this rite, in other words. A separate prayer called the teleoesis gave one full remission of sins. So the Cathari are like an alternate clergy, and that's what's interesting. They're like a Gnostic sect with secret hierophants or something. They're kind of like a satanic sect or something. Like a Masonic sect. Anyway, but they believe that they could remit sins through these different rites and prayers. The Cathari worldview. This is interesting. After the fall of Adam, the angel who formed the soul of man left his spirit behind in heaven, and thus in the ritual of the consolamentum, the spirit and soul of man were reunited, and the soul would then pass out of the domain of Satan. Almost sounds like Scientology, like you're trapped in your Thetans have got you trapped or something, I don't know. But to attain to this secret rite was an arduous task. You must be approved by the other perfecti after 1 year of a probationary period. During this probationary period, you could eat no meat, no milk, no eggs, no cheese. Vegans. You had to spend then 3 days a week on bread and water only, but you could eat fish. You could never have sex, because sexuality is part of Satan's creation. After 1 year, the initiate must then adhere to an even stricter ascetic practice. And every month, a time of confession is allowed for any minor offenses. If you had a single breach of the code, eating an egg, any sex, murder, once more involved a person in Satan's creation, and thus lost you the entire consolamentum ritual. Later, because hardly anybody could live up to this retarded nonsense, a reconciliation ritual was made up, but it was a heavy penance. So if you wanted to undergo the reconciliation ritual, it was going to be an even crazier penance. If a perfecti ever fell, it brought into doubt all of the initiates that he had consoled or had undergone his consolamentum. So like crazy level donatism here, right? Yet this harsh way of life was somehow itself attractive to a lot of simple peasant people. And this false piety, this false externalism, because it contrasted with the worldliness of the institutional church clergy, this is what convinced people. This is why it had an appeal. But remember what Paul says. It's just literally a repeat of everything Paul says in Colossians, right? Heretics are going to tell you to deny meats, to deny eggs, this kind of stupid stuff. And if you do that, you're somehow higher and more Gnostic. Literally all refuted in just Colossians. The only way to be saved was through the consolamentum ritual. The black robe that they wore, their thin, pale, gaunt appearance is what marked the perfecti. So they had an appearance of, like, look how pious we are. We're so, thin and pale and we don't eat meat. The believers adored these perfecti as if they were angels on earth. This whole religious system is quite obviously, it's nothing but pure hypocrisy and pride. The perfecti blessed and broke bread at their services, and they would even pray the Our Father. However, only the perfecti were allowed to say the Our Father. Social context of this heresy. The various towns where they had come to have power and authority had perfecti houses. The houses were either men or women. You had to keep them separate. They performed the consolamentum ritual, which eventually it copies the rite of extreme unction in the Latin Church. Extreme unction, the rite given to dying believers. In 1200, virtually all the entire population of Laurac had gone over to hear perfecti. They more or less converted. In Cambiac, the curate, the Roman Catholic curate, complained that he had lost all but 4 of his parishioners to the Cathari. In Caraman, Lanta, and Verfiel, by 1215, hardly anyone died without the rite of the consolamentum of the perfecti. So now entire cities, villages, bishops are complaining that the whole church is converted to this stupid heresy. Adherence to this heresy in many villages and places and towns simply became normal, understood Christianity. That's what people thought Christianity was now. Just like when you grow up in America, you grow up Baptist, you think that's what Christianity is. Jordan of Saxony. Jordan of Saxony, a famous or a lesser known Dominican, complained how daughters were given over to the perfecti, women homes, like they had their own version of nunneries, basically convents, and thus because the peasants were giving their daughters over to the perfecti convents, this was just leading more and more people into heresy. Do you see the patterns of history? That's why this is so important and so fascinating, is that these patterns repeat. Everything Paul refutes in the New Testament, it just pops up again as a repeat. The female perfecti. The perfecti had an almost egalitarian status for women. Interesting. Women and men were basically no different. The Cathari had an intricate system of how they ran their cult. Traveling merchants would make contacts. Public businesses were thus casual meeting places, and signs would be made known, secret signs and symbols. Things were drawn on houses to let people know what were Cathari safe houses. So if you were a secret Cathari, you had to have secret churches, and they put little whatever their secret codes were. The Cathari taught that the institutional church, the Roman institutional church, was Satan's church. Well, and by extension, any of the other Orthodox churches as well. The initiates and believers weren't immediately introduced to the more Gnostic, esoteric doctrines. Shocker. The Cathari cast doubts on the validity of anything that the institutional church taught, particularly their materialistic Mass. So the Roman Catholic Mass, the liturgy, was materialistic and therefore for profane, uninitiated. The Gnostic Cathari, however, had secret revelations that would later be revealed to the initiate as they climbed up the rank, and they were told that this was equal to the apostolic teaching, quote unquote. Their proof text for this was Matthew 13:11, which they said was their secret teaching. The evil principle in the world is equal to the good principle. Both evil and good are co-eternal battling principles. It is the material world, this world, that is Satan's kingdom. It will never come to an end. Satan will always have dominance over this eternal physical world. One theory as to the origin of this in terms of Bogomalism was a dualist missionary by the name of Nicetas. Nicetas was a dualist heretic from Constantinople in the 1160s who perhaps brought this dualism to the West. The basic presupposition of this whole sect and this whole religion is that body and soul, matter and spirit are utterly incompatible. The origin of the Cathari myths. So the Cathari actually have their own texts and scriptures and myths. They use some of the Bible, but they'll reinterpret it. The Cathari fables. For one, they used scripture, non-canonical Christian legends, Jewish apocalyptic literature, their own imagination, the vision of Isaiah, the interrogation of John, this weird, pseudepigraphical text, Gnostic basically text, and odd texts that purport to explain the fall of Satan. Okay, the interrogation of John is an odd text that purports to explain some weird thing. The fall of Satan has taken on the form of a serpent to have sex with Eve through his tail. So here we get like Babylonian Talmud type stories, right? Kabbalistic stories. The perfecti amongst the Cathari could alter and mix up these tales to make them sound really cool and appealing, and use them. Basically, they could alter them and use them as needed. Radical Cathari. There were even radicals amongst them. The radical Cathari were extremely deterministic. The fall was an act of free will. The fall was not an act of free will, but was in fact intended to happen. And in their myth is one of a satanic conquest, whatever that means. The perfecti had vernacular translations that they would take these texts, put them into the vernacular. That was part of the reason why they had success, was whoever could read would read these texts, and maybe they couldn't read Latin. The Cathari sympathizer would be awarded a reincarnate body higher in the scale of being. If you came over to the Cathari, they would say, well, follow us, you'll get a higher body. The true affinities of the Cathari were with Far Eastern ascetics. In other words, like Far Eastern religions, Hindu type ascetics. So you can see the parallels with like Hinduism here, obviously. The vegetarian, vegan type of stuff. Morality here is replaced not with right and wrong 10 commandments, but with severe bodily asceticism. The Cathari denied the divinity of Christ. Shocker, right? Obviously all these heretics do. Son and Spirit are subordinate entities to the Father, nor was he fully human. His humanity could not be fully human because Satan created the flesh and humanity. There were two gods and there were two creations. This was, in fact, another religion altogether. So basically a Gnostic mythos using certain Bible texts and other texts to have a totally other religion. Hope you guys are enjoying this. I'll read a couple super chats since I've been doing this for about an hour 40. Hopefully we're not lagging too bad. but an hour ago. Now, Bill says, do you or David know enough about the Assyrians to steelman or refute them? Yeah, I think we do know pretty well the Assyrian Nestorian view. I mean, I've read Nestorius. I've read significant sections of St. Cyril. I don't think it would be too hard to do that. I mean, we can eventually deal with that, I think. Gerald Norris, $100. Wow. I'd never read all this stuff myself. Keep going. Well, it is a 500 or 600 page mega tiny print book. So that's why I'm doing this, is that most people are not going to read this. And so you're getting graduate level stuff for pennies on the dollar. So thank you very much, Gerald Norris. I'm honored that you would give me that much. I appreciate it. Atala, $5. I love your work. You greatly helped my faith. God be with you from Lebanon. Hope you weren't in Beirut. But thank you for that. Searching, $3. I'm searching for my faith in Orthodoxy as an atheist. I was just bought an Orthodox study Bible on nihilism from your reading list. Awesome. What would be the next two to get? Well, if you're coming from the atheist realm, you probably have issue with like apologetic type stuff. So maybe get Ultimate Proof by Dr. Jason Lyle. That'd be a good one to start out. And maybe God's Revelation to the Human Heart by Father Seraphim Rose. That's a good complement to the nihilism book. Anon says for $5, I was born in Kaliningrad, formerly Königsberg, and my family moved to America. I was raised a mix of Russian American culture. The only religious traditions... I can't read these really long super chats, so I'm sorry they fall off the page, so I don't know what the rest of it is, but sorry about that, Anon. If you're asking about which one to choose, go Orthodox. How's that? James donates $10. Thank you, James. Much appreciated. Are ye aware? $20. What do you make of historical figures who are types of the Antichrist opposed to international usury? Napoleon, etc. Is it possible... I don't really think usury is the determining factor of Antichrist. I mean, there's nothing about that in any of the texts to deal with Antichrist. Now, will Antichrist engage in usury? Probably, but that's not really a defining. Go watch my video on Antichrist. I did a whole 45-minute talk on that. That's what I would recommend. But thank you for that super chat. Sorry, I can't read all of it. Remember, guys, that it needs to keep the super chat to about a sentence. You know, one long sentence. That's all that shows up on the screen. And I can't go open up Streamlabs to read the entire comments because it's too many windows open at once. It slows the whole computer down. Because I'm running YouTube streaming and I'm running Streamlabs at once. All right, we've gone almost 2 hours. I'm going to do a little bit more because I'm souped up. I got energy. I'm having fun. We got almost 300 people. Who else is telling you in-depth 600-page books on the history of Catharism? Who else is doing that for you? By the way, this is a half and half. I'm not going to read 600-page books and summarize them for you without you guys helping me out and supporting me. You're getting graduate level stuff for pennies on the dollar. So subscribe at JaysAnalyisis to the members section if you want the full analysis. We've done, this is a big book. We've only dented, this is like literally probably 100 pages of notes. So I don't think we're going to get this in one big talk. This is probably going to take 2 or 3 different installments to finish this book. But it'll be unique because nobody else is doing this kind of a in-depth type of thing. The fall of Catharism came from internal dissensions. As usual, heretical groups and movements collapse from within because they're all impelled by ego and lunatics and demons. Some took radical dualist views, and then some of them turned around and took monist views. excuse me, not monist, semi-dualist views, excuse me. But dualism can easily flip over into monism, by the way. The major Cathari, the major Cathar book was called the Book of Two Principles. So there's a shocker, right? It shows that Italian Cathari were beginning to feel the weight of the Catholic apologetic of the time. So they were having to constantly deal with the Catholic apologetic. They were getting beaten over time. And so the Cathari attempted to adopt, and they took on many Catholic elements. So originally it's this really radical thing, but now they're kind of blending a little more. They're kind of watering it down a little more because they're having trouble with the apologetic arguments. Innocent III launches a crusade on the Cathari. It's called the Waldensian Crusade. It scatters the Cathari at first, and many of the perfecti end up being killed. Between 1229 and 1237, many prominent families in Toulouse were persecuted. The Council of Toulouse in 1229 set out principles based on ad abellendam, the anti-heretic bull, for supervising the deviations to Catholic dogma. The first commissions of Gregory IX to the Dominicans came in 1233. They were some of the most formidable statements of repression. They weren't immediately successful, however. They were the heretics were driven out of Toulouse for a time in 1235. The mechanism for repressing heresy became more efficient over time. The tide begins to turn with a guy named Peter of Saila. Peter of Saila was an inquisitor and a companion of Dominic. The fear of punishment did end up causing many of the heretics to avail themselves of what is called a time of grace. So they kind of did this thing where they would send the Dominican or the Inquisitor out, and they would say, here's catechesis, come to the catechesis, get taught, we'll sit and debate, refute your heresies. Then you get a time of grace, 3 months, 6 months, a year. If you keep preaching your heresy, then you go to trial. That's how it worked. Basically, I mean, they would vary that model. A party of inquisitors had been, in fact, killed by nobles in one of the arguments. Interesting. So I'm assuming that note means that even some of the nobles had kind of converted over to heretical views. Now the Cathari will, they're not done. They're going to eventually get entire damn castles that they own. It's crazy. I'm going to have a little piece of candy so I can stay awake. Summation of Catharism. The appeal to Scripture was made easier by the vernacular translations of Scripture. The true foundation, however, was in Far Eastern religions and their ascetic teachings, Gnosticism, and the fakirs of China and India. Catharism was influenced by fakirs in China and India. Catharism truly is the heir to Bogomalism. It was an upset. I don't know what that note means. It has an upset sacramental life in exchange for a lifetime of sacramental living in favor of one rite of supreme. Oh, I see. Catharism upsets sacramental life. In other words, this is interesting. Your whole life becomes preparation for this one rite of consolamentum. So rather than, weekly mass or weekly confession, your entire life is preparing you for these lunatic hierarchs in this crazy cult to give you this weird ritual that will unite your spirit to your soul or whatever, free you from the body and Satan. It almost sounds like Heaven's Gate type of stuff, right? Like, didn't Marshall Applewhite say that when the aliens come, you're going to leave your body and your body's evil? He had some kind of weird thing like this too. Cathari replaced Christian morality with compulsory extreme asceticism. Sin is purely a metaphysical state of being and not an act of the will or a violation of moral law. Note, that's a huge difference. It eliminated redemption by denying the incarnation of Christ and his crucifixion in favor of a subordination of the Spirit and the Son to the Father, and was radically dualistic. Catharism is therefore an extreme Christian heresy and ultimately a different religion altogether. The dramatic fall of Catharism. From a major threat to the church in the 13th century, early 13th century, to a persecuted minority, to the full-on disappearance by the 14th century. It arrived in the 1140s. Well, I don't know what that note means, but basically, having arrived in the 1140s with the Bogomil influence and the Nicetas of Constantinople influence, the historical writers about the sect of Nicetas are Anselm of Alessandria and some random dude from Lombardy. Both attach significance to the visit of Nicetas to bring these Eastern cult ideas. We're not talking about Eastern Orthodox. So basically, Nicetas of Constantinople appears to have been some kind of bishop. A bishop called Nicetas of Constantinople. I don't think he was the Bishop of Constantinople, Archbishop, whatever. He was some guy from Constantinople called the Bishop Nicetas, who had been influenced by Far Eastern fakir dualistic philosophy, probably Chinese, Indian philosophy. He brings that at the same time as Bogomilism comes over to Western Europe. That's the point here. Bishop Nicetas taught that the existing church order is faulty. Nicetas ordained his own monks, and one of those monks becomes the first Cathari bishop of Italy. He claimed that only he had the valid consolamentum that had come from the Far East. Patricius of Bulgaria came and doubted the validity of Nicetas and his orders. So here the heretics are fighting amongst themselves because the Eastern Cathari, one guy named Simon, gave the consolamentum to Nicetas. In other words, Nicetas' lineage of this made-up consolamentum rite was invalid because the guy that gave it to him had lapsed. That's what I'm trying to say. From this, factions and divisions rose. We're describing the fall of Catharism. So they fought amongst themselves, and they basically just collapsed. Two parties formed. One of those was led by a guy named Judaeus, who succeeded Mark, one of the Cathari. And the rival sect was Peter of Florence. At Mossi, a council was held to unify Cathari. So the Cathari have their own council. At Mossi, Italy. The Cathari chose a head bishop named Geratus, who was prepared to go on a long journey to Bulgaria to search to find the true consolamentum ritual. Just as the collection was being made for his journey, he was discovered to be in reprehensible circumstances having sex with a woman. And that was not allowable for Cathari, so I guess we can't send that guy to find the true ritual. So the attempt at unity, the Cathari council ended up in an orgy by their leader, and the whole thing collapsed. Others were sent to find valid consolamentum rituals and failed. Bulgaria was supposed to be a stronghold of Bogomilism, and so the Cathari did not generally... I can't read my note there. That's why they were going to Bulgaria. Catharism, however, did not typically contain antinomian teachings. This was the view of the Massalians, right? The testimony of the Inquisition shows that the Cathari were not, in fact, antinomian, but did have a strict code, so to speak. Not that they necessarily kept it. As we said, their major book was the Book of Two Principles. Yet eventually the Cathari began to feel the pressure of the Catholic apologetic. The Catholic polemicist forced the Cathari to think more about their dualism and whether it was coherent. For the Cathari, their dualism had actually previously been kind of in the background of their theology. Through the Catholic apologetic and argumentation, they more and more forced the Cathari to deal with the implications of their strict dualism. One of the Cathar theologians came to this conclusion, John of Lugio, and this was another indicator in their collapse. Was one of their major theologians, I guess, was having problems with this. Innocent III, the crusade against the Cathars did appear to be effective. First in Languedoc and then in Italy. In 1225, they held a council at Prius to set up a new diocese. Between 1229 and 1237, the backbone of Catharism had been completely broken in Toulouse due to the surrender of the pro-Cathar count. So the state is propping them up. So notice, this is probably not just a bunch of weirdos. If they had not had state and princely noble aid, just as Luther will have aid from the German princes, none of this would even work, right? So as soon as the count on this place surrenders, where do you go? What do you know? The sect begins to collapse. A council in Toulouse was set up a systematized canonical police system to root out heretics based on the Pope's ad abolendam bull. Gregory IX commissions, as we said, the Dominicans to drive out Catharism. The Dominicans proved very effective at this. They were driven out of Toulouse by 1235 by the Dominicans, mainly from 1240 to 1243. This is the turning point. Peter of Saila, the companion of Dominic, and the only, I can't read my notes there, but he was a moderate inquisitor for a while. He at first was a moderate inquisitor. He later achieved much success, and many people availed themselves of the time of grace because they feared the future punishment. Oh, that's because they would give them a 3-year period. I see what I'm saying. So basically 1240 to 1243 was like the grace period. So they would come and preach, and you had like 1 or 2 or 3 years of your period of grace before the state would come and the inquisitors handed you over to the state. A group of inquisitors were murdered by Cathari in Avignon. I can't read my note. It looks like it says Avignon. This resulted in a siege on the Cathari stronghold or castle in the Pyrenees. 200 Cathars ended up arrested, including the Cathari bishops of Toulouse and Rozay. In 1249, Count Raymond II abandoned his policy of tolerance and now began to persecute. He burned 80 Cathari suspects in one day in, I can't tell what city, Agen. His successor, Alphonse of Poitiers, was brother to King Louis IX and became a hard-handed persecutor of all heretics. The last Cathar was burned in Languedoc as late as 1330. From 1243, the writing was on the wall, and Catharism had been rooted out and collapsed. Bernard of Caux, C-A-U-X, interrogated 5,471 suspected heretics. Querillo, Querilous, was the last castle stronghold of the Cathari. If you go and look up the Cathari castles, you'll see like 7 or 8 of them that they had all somehow obtained these castle strongholds. So they had to have, state elite support for this. The last of their castles, the many Cathari castles, was this Querillo or whatever. Bernard of Co had interrogated, however, so many of them that his sentences or penalties listed out of the 5,471, 207 were sentenced, 23 were imprisoned, and the rest were given yellow crosses and other penances. Bernard of Co had, in fact, not burned anyone. The records were recalled after a few years. And then, so what they would do is they would interrogate. You would have this penalty that you wear a yellow cross for 3 years as a penance. And what I'm saying is that people think of Inquisition as like just billions of people being burned, which is all just pure nonsense. In this one example of Bernard of Co, interrogating 5,471 persons, 207 of them were sentenced as recalcitrant heretics. Only 23 ended up in jail, and the others were given penance, and no one was put to death. So it wasn't as crazy as people make it out to be. Now, as we'll see, there's different inquisitions. Okay, there's Papal Inquisition. There's earlier state inquisitions that we saw in these sections, and there's Spanish Inquisition. Spanish Inquisition is going to be directly under like Isabella and stuff, right? Papal Inquisition is supposed to be directly under the Pope. So there's not just everybody doing, there's different types of inquisitions, and eventually there becomes the Holy Office of the Inquisition. Okay, so these are developments that take a long time. Don't get this stuff confused. But even still, the entirety of the Inquisition did not murder millions of people. I think Henry Common says it was a few thousand. So this is all exaggeration. And I'm not a Roman Catholic, but I'm going to be honest and fair with what the secular scholars say about this stuff. Where Catharism of the 1240s declined from persecution, the Perfecti switched the black robes for hidden girdles and retreated to the country. Simultaneously, Dominic's house for abandoned women and abandoned Cathari girls grew popular. Cathar leaders authorized them to then shed blood. So now they turn into a bloody cult. The Indura was a form of Cathari self-imposed suicide. It was consonant with the ancient Greek Gnostic idea of the body being the imprisoning power by the demiurge, Plato, Soma, same, the body's the prison, body's the tomb. And as a result, the perfectionist mindset ended up in a suicide cult. There was a brief Cathar revival. Now, we're kind of jumping around in time, not because the notes are out of place, but he's just kind of looking at the course of it, reflecting upon it. Pierre Autier in 1295 and his brother Guillaume helped to evangelize their relatives for Catharism. Pierre ended up captured and burnt in 1311, and this was the ultimate final death blow to Catharism. The fall was due solely to the determined use of the machinery of a few churchmen. Country Catharism was a household manifestation of a parachurch organization. The Cathars would only marry other Cathars at this stage. This doesn't really make any sense because marriage was outlawed, but The sect can, of course, change with the times, as sects always do. And now you can kill, now you can be bloody. Oh, we were pacifists, now we're revolutionary, bloody. I guess you can be married now. The deathbed consolamentum purported to grant full assurance of salvation, and this is what gave it larger. So basically, you could do whatever you wanted, and then just do the deathbed suicide ritual to achieve salvation. This is just crazy stuff. Another heretic pops up around this time called Ivo of Narbonne. Ivo was a wandering preacher who fell in with the Cathars. He sent missionaries to the Sorbonne to destroy Catholicism from within by gaining an inner knowledge of Catholicism at the university. That's a weird one, just a random guy that pops up. The murder of Inquisitor Peter Martyr in 1252 was an action of the Cathari because of the persecution of heretics in Milan. The struggles between Frederick II and the Pope kept the heretics alive. It actually slowed the persecution, so the Pope starts having problems with the Emperor, and the Cathari take advantage of this. Milan's heretics were brought to order at the end of the 13th century with along with Boulogne in 1309. The last heretical Cathar bishop listed in Western Europe was a Cathar bishop of Tuscany in 1321. Peter Martyr, Roman Catholic saint, started up confraternities for the suppression of heretics. Could you imagine this after Vatican II? A famous Western saint starting up a confraternity for the suppression of heretics. Catholicism revived in this Cathar suppressed atmosphere. So after a few centuries, Catharism's on the way out. 1300s, you're now getting revival of Catholicism. Heresy was squeezed into its ultimate oblivion in this time period. Heresy in the Roman Catholic Church. Knowledge was expanding in the 13th and 14th century. At this time, universities are popping up everywhere. New medical schools are popping up. And so this is making it more difficult to kind of deceive, so many peasants at a local level. The new piety of Francis of Assisi and the emphasis on Christ's human life also helped kill Catharism and its dualism and Gnosticism. This incarnational emphasis of Francis appears to have helped ideologically. However, as we said, a new danger was beginning to emerge that we started this talk out with because my notes are out of order. Joachimism. There's going to be a heresy even within Franciscans. Chapter 8, the Waldensians after Bergamo. I can't read my note. Only the Waldensians continued to survive out of this time period. All the other crazy cults that we mentioned, they all die out. Only the Waldensians survive from after 1213 up into 16th century. So they make it for a few centuries, then they're out. You're done. Compared to most of the other medieval heresies, they're really the only one that had longevity, relatively speaking. They outlasted the persecutions. The Protestants who would later go investigate them found them undereducated, primitive, and still too Catholic. So even the Waldensians didn't make it make the Protestant cut because Protestants, I guess, went and met with them at the time of the Reformation. The failed Council of Bergamo, the Rescriptum, is the only document that survives the Council of Bergamo. I guess this is a Waldensian council. I don't know what that means. There was a great upheaval in the 13th and 14th century due to the imperial papal conflicts. So the Pope starts having problems with his Western emperor, and this is leading to civil upheaval. The Waldensians supported Emperor Frederick II against the Pope. The Waldensians declared all Catholic stuff null and void because of clerical sin. The Waldensians, however, made quite a bit of headway in Germany. Wealthy families in Strasbourg and Augsburg donated heavy sums of money to the Waldensians, which helped them going. Germany then became the base of the Waldensian heresy. All right. Got a couple more super chats. I'll hit those up, but my voice is starting to crack, even though we've still got a solid audience of about 255. I'll finish up this page, and then it looks like we've got a little more on the Waldensians, and then we come to Gregory the Ninth and John the 22nd, the famous popes. We will deal with the poor Lombards, some other weird, random, creepy heretics. We will deal with papal disputes with emperors, Inquisition debates, Templars, the Free Spirit heresy. They sound neat, right? What's the Free Spirit heresy? The Spiritualists, the Great Western Schism, not Eastern Orthodox Schism, the Great Western Schism. Fra Dolcino, and much, much more. And then we'll come up to, guess who's after all that? John Wycliffe. Now we're starting to get into that pre-Reformation stuff. Right? I don't know how much of that will be in part 2 because we've still got a lot of notes on this book. We've only covered maybe 1/3 of the notes. So again, this will probably be multiple talks. I'm going to close it out here with this. Papal Anonymous. Papal Anonymous, Dominican of the late 13th century, and author of a compilation debating with Jews, heretics, Antichrist, which dates from the second half of the 13th century, is what gives us the detailed picture of the Waldensian worldview. This is 1266 AD. Papal Anonymous gives an account of the Inquisition of 42 Waldensians. Papal says that they had no hierarchy amongst them. They believed that all of their members could preach, even the children. Even kids can preach. 10 sites are outlined as Waldensian schools. So they had set up 10 different places where they had schools. They will be very similar to the coming 15th century group known as the Lollards. The Waldensians believed that the words of consecration could be spoken by a layperson or even a woman. So they believe in women priests. The durability of the movement lay in the faults of the existing clergy. So once again, the corruption of the institutional Roman Church is what powers and fuels the peasantry buying into Waldensianism. Malcolm Lambert notes that corruption of the institutional clergy is quite often the case of the spread of heresy. However, the Waldensians were very superstitious and ignorant. They believed that all churches that were institutional were harlots, and they claimed to have and possess outrageous, absurd miracles. So once again, I mean, every sect has to go, oh, we have crazy miracles. This proves us right. It was mostly, however, ignorant peasants. The newly converted were immediately ordained as missionaries who were sent out to convert as many people to the sect as possible. They told all these people to immediately become street evangelists who used all kinds of tactics, tricks, and methods to get people to come to their Bible studies, which were held in secret. They stressed the vernacular reading of the Bible, the simple interpretation of the text. Here's Protestant stuff. And their overall theology was basically fundamentalist and Donatist. Anything that had been done by a sinful preacher, priest, or cleric or bishop was invalid, and the Bible should just be read by the simple people. In some cases, they actually would murder hierarchical clerics, the Roman Catholic prelates. Other notable heresies that Papal Anonymous, the Dominican, found within the Waldensians was that they did not believe in any icons or images. They did not believe in any relics. Pilgrimages should not be done. No one should take an oath. There was no after-death journey or purgatory. They had a pure literalism when they read simple Bible texts. That's his take. I'm not saying purgatory in the Roman Catholic view is true. Anyway, sorry. That is about the first third of Malcolm Lambert's book summarized. It was a little bit out of order. Sorry about that. My notes are kind of chaotic and archaic. Family plan for $5 says double duty day. Good job. I mean, it doesn't feel like work for me to sit back and talk about, mega scholarly 600-page tomes. That's not work for me. That's enjoyable. And, joking around and talking with Tristan, that was fun. It's enjoyable. That's leisure to me, bro. Leisure to me. Fawns for $5. It seems the papal schism was an explosion of heresy in the West. Absolutely. It might be God hardening the heart, AJ? Do you mean the papal heart? I'm not sure, but yeah, I think that these are manifestations, not totally, but partly due to problems within the West in terms of their theology. Now, there can always be corrupt clergy. I'm not saying that. There's plenty of corrupt clergy throughout the East. And Bogomalism and the heretic Nicetas. These are Gnostics who do come from the East. Sure. No denying that. But there's something fundamentally wrong here, in the papal situation, as we're going to continue to see. I believe the solution to that problem is in the bad theology. Absolute divine simplicity, filioque, rejecting Nicaea II, which is what the Carolinians do, which we covered with Sneck. That's the root of what's going on here in the West. And the rise and the innovations and changes that nobody denies anymore, unless you're like a know-nothing online pop Roman Catholic apologist. The Vatican and its apologists and theologians have recognized a marked change between the operations of the church in the first 8, 9, 10 centuries and what begins to change with the rise of the papal monarchy afterwards. Exactly. Ecclesiology is affected on the basis of theology, not the other way around. So, that's what's going on here. But we're not really here to, we're not here to lecture on absolute divine simplicity. We're looking at the scholarly approach to these largely unknown century. A lot of people don't even know anything about this time period. It's really fascinating, crazy, wild stuff. I was really into this book when I read it years ago. So, enlightening stuff for sure. Thank you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Probably the next day or two, I'll do the second half. And depending on how far I get in the notes in the second half, I'll determine whether there will be another one. So, Thank you for joining me. Be sure and share this if you would. Give me that like.